Welcome, guys, and thanks for joining me on TAP, otherwise known as the Alphabet Podcast. I'm your host, Leanna Devine, and today I'm going to be talking about eating disorders. Now, it's something that I've wanted to speak about on this podcast for a very long time, and some of you may be thinking, why does she want to talk about eating disorders? It's a mental health podcast. Well, there are a few very good reasons why eating disorders need to be spoken about a lot more. Now, at least 1.25 million people in this country, the UK, have an eating disorder of some kind. Okay, eating disorders are not about food, they are about feelings. So I want to clear that up straight away. Eating disorders are not about food, they are about feelings. And they are the biggest killer of all mental health conditions. So that's even more than depression and even more than schizophrenia. And thirdly, they're on the rise. So I feel like it's time that we take a closer look at eating disorders and who's at risk of getting them, what can we do about them, how to spot it in yourself, maybe how to spot it in a loved one. So it's similar to domestic abuse that I did the last time on this podcast. A lot of people got back to me and they said, Lee, after listening, I realized that not only are some people that I love being abused, but potentially I've had experiences of being abused without even realizing. So please, guys, don't be triggered if you listen to this podcast and through listening to it, you may discover that potentially you may have an eating disorder, because eating disorders are treatable. Early intervention is better, but they are perfectly treatable and you can go on to have a healthy relationship with food. So they're on the rise. They're very lethal. But what else? What are eating disorders? By the end of this podcast, we'll know. How common are they? Okay, so who is it affecting? How common are they? I've said 1.25 million people, but potentially more than that. What types of eating disorder? Because I feel like people are able to identify maybe the two main ones in anorexia and bulimia. But what are the risk factors for eating disorders? So who gets them? What puts you more at risk of getting an eating disorder? Then I would like to look in a bit more detail at eating disorders and the Black community, because I feel like there's a particular set of challenges to do with the Black community and eating disorders. Then I'd like to have a look at some of the stigmas and the myths, and then finally what we can do. But what I'd like us all to be able to take away from this podcast, whether or not we have an eating disorder or not, I would like to make it clear that we all have a relationship with food. Now, it may be not something that we think about very often, but it's very important. And things like food and sleep, they underlie our mental health. So all mental health. So usually when I'm checking in with clients, exploring their relationship with food is a big part of what we do in sessions. So I'm happy to share a little bit later on about my own relationship with food, but I hope by the end of this podcast, you'll maybe be looking a little bit closer at your own relationship with food. So guys, before I get on to what eating disorders are, I just want to say thank you for some of the feedback that I'm getting. I'm getting some very good feedback, particularly on TikTok. It's been a bit slow on YouTube, which I'm trying to, encourage you guys to share as much as possible, because it's all well and good people coming back to me and saying to me they enjoyed the podcast, but I'd like for you to share that so that someone else can potentially listen to that podcast, identify something in their self, and then share it with someone else. So we can have a domino effect. We need to start spreading information, positive information, and information that's useful in our lives. So, what are eating disorders? You hear about them, you maybe can identify the main ones, anorexia, bulimia, but what are eating disorders? So let's clear that up straight away. And the reason why they're on this podcast, and the reason why I have been trying to get a podcast together on eating disorders, because I don't even think they're seen as a mental illness. So the first thing I will say is that eating disorders are serious mental illnesses that involve disordered eating behavior as a way to deal with difficult feelings. Okay, so eating disorder behavior may involve limiting the amount of food, eating large amounts at once, and disposing of food in an unhealthy way. So that may be through vomiting, purging, using laxatives, and so forth. It's usually diagnosed by looking at a list of behavioral, physical, and psychological symptoms. So they'll look at all of these different symptoms and give you a diagnosis. Now, eating disorders do not discriminate. And I think a lot of people have a stereotypical image of potentially an eating disorder being a young, white, middle class teenager, potentially having anorexia, maybe starving themselves, and it being quite serious. I think of Nikki Graham from Big Brother, for those of you that are old enough to remember her, and her struggles, which eventually led to her death. Now, they do not discriminate. Anybody can be affected by an eating disorder. Okay, we'll look at that a little bit later on, but at least 25% of people that suffer from eating disorders are men. So once again, it's not a gendered issue. I've said it and I'll keep on saying it. Eating disorders are not just about food. They are mainly about feelings. But food is what is controlled in order to manage these feelings. And once again, they kill more people than any other mental illness. So that's the reason why it's so important that it's on this podcast. It's so important that it's spoke about, because I feel like there's a lot of shame around eating disorders. And I genuinely believe that a lot of people with eating disorders do not even realize that they're suffering from an eating disorder. Okay, so how common are eating disorders? So I said at the beginning that 1.25 million people potentially suffer from eating disorders in the UK. But I've seen figures that suggest that it's up to 3.4 million people, okay, in the UK. What that tells you is that the stats, like I said, always continue to say, do not always tell the whole story. Whether it's 1.25 million or 3.4 million people, that's a hell of a lot of people that are suffering with an eating disorder. Now, this is the thing that struck me the most when I was looking at some stats, because I don't feel like they need too many stats, eating disorders. I feel like the first point should be to discuss it. We can look at stats, but stats only tell part of the story. But between the years of 2017 to 20, okay, hospital admissions for eating disorders have been on the rise. Now, so that's on the rise for everybody. So white, black, all ethnicities, it's been on the rise. So that tells us, like what I said at the beginning, that eating disorders are on the rise, or at least the treatment of and people seeking help for eating disorders is on the rise, because I feel like it's something that's always happened behind closed doors. Okay, so it's on the rise. So 30% more white people are being admitted to hospital. Okay, so that's 30%, big amount. 53% more ethnic minorities, and this includes the rest of the black population minus black Africans. And I'll tell you why it minuses black Africans in a minute. But 53% more ethnic minorities. So once again, black people are showing up higher in the figures. But what I found astounding was that 216%, there's been a 216% rise in the amount of black Africans seeking treatment for eating disorders in hospital. So hospital admissions, 216%. Wow. Okay. So back to what I was saying about it not discriminating, 25% of eating disorder sufferers are male. And potentially, as we know with men, they don't always speak about these things. It could be higher. So it does not discriminate. Gay men, so looking at some LGBTQ plus figures, gay men are 7 times more likely to report binge eating and 12 times more likely to report purging than heterosexual men. So there's something definitely going on there, whether it's to do with body image, I'm not sure, but it needs looking at. So when we're thinking about how common these eating disorders are, I feel like me personally growing up, when I thought of an eating disorder, I did think of your stereotypical middle class or upper class white girl, young girl, usually a teenage, that was starving herself. But let's look a bit closer at this. So anorexia only makes up between about 8 to 10% of all eating disorders. So actually what we all look at and think of as an eating disorder, as a stereotype, that's only 8 to 10% of people. So what does the rest of the 90% look like? So we have bulimia, which is something that's quite prevalent in the black community. We'll speak about that a bit later. It's about 19%, makes up about 19% of all eating disorders. And then we have binge eating disorder, which is an even bigger problem in the black community, accounting for 22% of all eating disorder sufferers. Then we have things like avoidant restrictive intake food disorder, or ARFID, 5%. Okay, so that's avoiding certain foods and restricting certain foods from your diet. And the rest, which fit into a category which we will call OSFED, which is other specified feeding and eating disorders, makes up 47%. Disorders that fit into that category, feeding and eating disorders that fit into that category, they may have some traits of some of the other ones, but can't be fit into that box categorically. But there are loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of other feeding and eating disorders that most people haven't even heard of. Okay, so actually, like I said before, what we think of when we think about eating disorders, that stereotypical image of someone starving themselves, is not even true. So we have to look at these stereotypes, because people are literally eating themselves to death. Okay, and it's not being spoken about. Once again, eating disorders are more common between the ages of 16 and 40. But that does not mean that it doesn't affect everybody. It can affect anybody of all ages. And actually, incidences of younger people and older people as old as 70 suffering from eating disorders. It's not discriminating. It really isn't. As you probably would expect, it often coexists with other mental illnesses. So you'd look at maybe things like depression and expect it. But things like PTSD, eating disorders and PTSD go very well together. Both have aspects of dissociation, especially with things like bulimia and binge eating. You can dissociate and use food to fill an emotional void, and you can purge or be sick and get rid of unwanted feelings. So fits very well with things like depression and PTSD, whether you're using it to dissociate, to rid yourself of unwanted feelings, or to feel clean in some cases. So another interesting stat, women with physical disabilities are more likely to develop eating disorders. Once again, they're already suffering from disabilities, and now eating disorders are thrown on top. So it's not just about food, eating disorders, it's about feelings, all right? Now, I've not stopped talking about this, and you're probably sick of hearing me say it, but at least, and I will say at least because I think it's higher, at least 30% of those that have an eating disorder have been sexually abused as children. And I've seen some other stats that say that children that have suffered other types of abuse make up about 50% of eating disorder sufferers. And there is a clear link with PTSD. So there is a very distinct link and correlation between eating disorders and trauma. So once again, I will say to you, eating disorders are more about feelings than food. And that's very important that we understand that. What is also very important is that people who have family members who have an eating disorder have a higher risk of having other family members that also have an eating disorder. You see it with self-harm sometimes, copycat behavior, but you also see it with eating disorders. Especially with teenagers, it's important that you pick it up quite early, because other siblings, maybe friendship groups, this pattern of behavior could be spread. This is a big one. Going back to my last podcast was on domestic abuse, and we spoke about the adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs, and how abuse made it more likely that you would suffer from other things. But it's a big one that's here. Victims and observers of domestic abuse are more likely to develop eating disorder. So all of that tumultuous behavior in the home, all of that violence, hiding all of those feelings, all of the other types of abuse that may be occurring. So you don't necessarily have to be a victim of abuse. Just simply witnessing abuse can make you more likely to have an eating disorder. So how many people are in that category? Okay, now this is really important. 60% of people with eating disorders will also have suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So once again, this is why we're talking about it. So we talk about depression, killing so many people, but I did mention in depression. So if you'd like to go back and listen to that, because it's important that we get rid of some of these stigmas and these misconceptions. You would expect something like depression to maybe kill more people, but eating disorders actually kills more people. So when we talk about eating disorders, what kind of things are we talking about? All right. There are quite a few eating disorders, and I will have a look at my notebook here because there's a lot of points for this one. So we're going to look at the main ones, and then maybe some more of the obscure ones as we go along. I wish I could have some literature, some words to go up here, because it's a lot of points. So you guys may need to rewind this a few times just to pick it up. So I do apologize. Maybe going forward, I will have some bullet points to go with it just to make it easier. But before we look at the specific eating disorders, let's look at some general signs of eating disorders, okay? So general dieting behaviors which show food as a primary concern. You could have an individual who's maybe counting calories or the fat content, very concerned with the finer details of the food, all right? Another big one that is present in all mental illness, withdrawal from social circles, possibly to make time for these eating disorder behaviors. Obviously, you're not doing these behaviors in front of people. You need privacy. So you may need to withdraw from events or isolate yourself so that you're able to potentially go to the bathroom and purge, or to miss a meal and nobody notice. Avoiding meal times or situations involving food. Very common in people with eating disorders. Just try to avoid it. Behaviors that are focused on food. They may go do a lot of shopping, a lot of cooking, all of the rest of those things, but not actually eating themselves. I remember Amy Winehouse's friends speaking a lot about how she used to invite people around and cook loads of food for them, but she never actually used to eat. And her struggles with eating disorders were very well known. She was very open about it. You can see how it coexists. You had depression, eating disorders, addiction. All of these things tend to coexist. So lying about the amount of food, or maybe the type of food that you're eating, avoiding questions about eating and weight. But what I will say, guys, if you're worried about someone with an eating disorder, maybe commenting on their weight is not the best way to go about it. In fact, it has the opposite effect. It can be quite alarming if we see someone and their physical appearance has changed, but actually drawing or highlighting that can actually be counterproductive. So things like eating a lot of food very fast. So I've said it already, going to the bathroom a lot after eating, potentially exercising a lot, which is something that people don't often associate with eating disorders. But remember, the aim with some of the eating disorders is not to gain weight. So obviously you need a calorie deficit. I'm a sports scientist. Most people understand that you need a calorie deficit to lose weight. So simply just not eating is not enough. Maybe so excessive exercising, avoiding eating with others. Food may have become a real problem. So potentially not comfortable to eat with others, cutting food into small pieces or eating very slowly. Sensitive to comments or perceived criticism about exercise, eating and weight. So remember what I said a minute ago, it's not always helpful to comment on weight, but if you notice that you've made this comment and this person has reacted very defensively, that could potentially be a sign of an eating disorder. Low self-esteem. Now, low self-esteem runs throughout mental health conditions. If you could do one thing for yourself, is to improve your self-esteem. Do things that make you feel good. Exercise so that you feel good and you look good. Okay, so you can change that negative self-perception, maybe some of those shameful feelings or guilt or self-loathing, because those are some of the feelings that people often try to purge when they're being sick from eating disorders. You're trying to purge all those feelings, or potentially the other way around with binge eating and bulimia, you're trying to eat those feelings away. Again, strong feelings of anger, anxiety, depression, which may trigger an eating disorder, and especially binges. So once again, are we eating our feelings? Are we eating our feelings, guys? Rigid thinking. And there's a condition, another eating disorder that's not really spoken about, but it's like a sub-eating disorder. So I don't really think it stands alone, but it's called orthorexia. And that involves labeling food good or bad. Now, I've seen that a lot in teenage boys, potentially sporty types, that want to take care of their body and look good and potentially want six packs, and that rigid thinking, only eating foods that are seen to be pure. Anorexia now is something that growing up I knew a lot about. There was a group in the 70s called the Carpenters, and I know their lead singer, Karen Carpenter, she passed away as a result of anorexia. So I've always been aware of anorexia and what it looks like. And I think a lot of people have got that in their mind as an eating disorder. And when you think of eating disorders, you think of people that don't eat, as opposed to eating too much potentially, or getting rid of it in unhealthy ways. So we've already said that anorexia only makes up about 8 to 10% of the people suffering from eating disorders. But why is it so important that we talk about it? Because it's a serious, potentially life-threatening eating disorder, which involves self-starvation, excessive weight loss as a result of a distorted body image, thinking that they're fat, even when bones are showing through, still believing wholeheartedly that they're fat. The person views themselves as fat, and there's no inability within that individual to see themselves as unwell. So a lot of denial. So there might be a lot of pushback if you're concerned about potentially your child having anorexia or your partner. You're going to get a lot of pushback because they're not going to have that self-awareness to see it because they've got that distorted body image. So what are the signs of anorexia? So you've got the dramatic weight loss, but things like feeling cold all the time, which people don't always necessarily associate. But if you have a low body weight and you're losing weight quite quickly, feeling cold all the time, even when it's warm, is a sign potentially that you're not eating enough. To stop weight gain, it may involve self-induced vomiting, purging. So this is where sometimes people that are anorexic also suffer from bulimia and the other way around. So those two conditions, they tend to swap around. So some people can have both. So it's not always one or the other. Things like appetite suppressants and I can't say that word, I never can. Diuretics. There we are, diuretics. Okay, but refusing to eat certain foods. So I'm not going to eat that. So it could be things like I'm not going to eat that particular food, or it could be like I'm not going to eat that particular food group. So potentially no carbs, no fats. And we know from nutrition that we need a bit of everything to be entirely healthy. Simple things like denying that they're hungry, because that's the easiest way to get out of eating food. You just say you're not hungry. Developing rituals around food, so eating things in a particular order. And once again, I said over-exercising. But some of the physical complications and things that may come with eating disorders that people do not necessarily put there as well. So we've got slow heart rate, low blood pressure, which the two things combined is a greater risk of having heart failure, which you don't want. Lack of calcium and minerals, so vitamin D and calcium, which can lead to osteoporosis, so that's brittle bones in your old age, but you can bring that on if you don't consume enough food. Severe dehydration, which is linked to kidney failure. So this is all of the things that you have going on. The things like fainting and fatigue that you would expect if you just don't eat. Because even me, if I don't eat for a few hours, sometimes I feel quite tired or I feel like I'm going to faint. So you imagine going days and starving yourself, that fainting is going to be more severe and more regular. So if your child potentially has got loads of episodes of fainting, maybe look at their diet. Like I said, sensitivity to cold. It can be so bad that the body grows a layer of hair in an attempt to try to keep you warm. So if you're seeing excess hair, normal hormonal function is affected. So if potentially it's a woman and she has periods, those periods might stop. If it's a prepubescent teenager, the puberty might not start at all. So delayed periods and stuff like that. So as a parent, I suppose those are the things that you'd be looking out for. But starving yourself, even a grown woman, that would stop your period. So things like that in your loved ones. The next main one we're going to talk about is bulimia nervosa. And I said earlier on that about 19% people that suffer from eating disorders suffer from this, potentially more. Like I said, guys, these figures are just a guide. I'm looking at them as a guide. I'm not looking at them as an exact science, because these things like eating disorders are not spoken about. So who are these people speaking to get these stats? Because I know people that are at their home, in their home now, that have not been asked about eating disorders, that are suffering from them. Whatever these figures show, it's going to be more. But bulimia, how it differs, I'll tell you how it differs first, and then I'll tell you the thing that is the same. But it involves excessive episodes of excessive eating, so binging, followed by behavior which aims to prevent weight gain. So things like purging, so that can be self-induced vomiting or the use of laxatives, excessive exercising, fasting. I see a lot of fasting going on these days, a lot of intermittent fasting and all of these different yo-yo diets and stuff. And I do often wonder if this disguises people's eating disorders. During binges, people may feel out of control of their eating and eat past being full. So with bulimia, there's no limit to this. We're just going to keep on eating. Sometimes, I've said it before, sometimes a person with bulimia may have had anorexia, sorry guys, or other way around. So it's not uncommon to cycle back between the two, which makes sense. The reason why it makes sense, and I'll make this clear, is that both anorexia and bulimia, the underlying fear is weight gain. So if you look at something like binge eating, which is the opposite, these two, the premise for these people is to not gain weight and a belief that they are fat. So that's how anorexia and bulimia are connected. So now let's look at some of the signs of bulimia, because I do think that people are aware that it exists, but they probably know a little bit less about bulimia as opposed to anorexia. So repeated episodes of eating large amounts of food in a short period of time. So we're looking at least twice a week for a period of 3 months before potentially a GP would diagnose an eating disorder. But it's important to note while I'm talking about GPs that, once again, sorry GPs, they often don't have extensive experience of things like this. So it's not unusual for someone to go to a GP with an eating disorder and be misdiagnosed or not even asked about food. So you may have to try a few times and try some specialist organizations for support. People with bulimia will be preoccupied with food and eating, and they will have strong compulsions to eat, like these cravings, almost like similar to drug cravings. So they will crave food or fiend for food. Okay. But to compensate for, so similar to drug cravings, compensate for binging through one or more of the following things. Okay. So you're binging, but you also, the aim is to get rid of this. So it can be self-induced vomiting, self-induced purging involving laxatives, periods of starving yourself. So once again, I said the link between anorexia and bulimia, and using appetite suppressants and diuretics, if that's how you say it. I've never been able to say that, even as a sports scientist, that word has come back to haunt me. Okay, so we're looking at things like frequent visits to the bathroom. So in order to purge and to do these behaviors, you'd need the privacy of a bathroom. Okay, look out for things like swelling of the cheeks and around the jaw, calluses on the back of the hand and knuckles due to self-induced vomiting, maybe evidence of people saying that they see themselves as too fat. So once again, that intense fear of weight gain is there. Discolored or stained teeth from stomach acid and bile. Dramatic weight loss is possible, but not always the case. So in typical bulimia, a person is underweight. Okay, so that's maybe where it will be more noticeable. But in atypical bulimia, a person is of a healthy weight. So going back to how people view eating disorders, and once again, me mentioning that this happens a lot in the Black community, I think we have to get away from looking at the idea that eating disorders only happen in smaller bodies. Okay, so you could be a normal weight and still have an eating disorder. So I think that's what it tells me. So that's what I'm going to relate to you. Now, physical health issues linked to bulimia are things like electrolyte imbalance because of the dehydration, lack of salts. This can cause an irregular heartbeat and heart failure. We don't want that, okay? Damage to your esophagus and your throat from the throwing up. I've already said the stained teeth and the tooth decay. Laxatives and binging. That combination can impair normal functioning of your digestive system and lead to chronic constipation. So you're going to have digestive issues potentially. It's rare but possible, but you can tear your stomach. So have a gastric rupture during a binge. That happens with binge eating disorder as well. But what I want us to really get away from is this idea that eating disorders happen in smaller bodies, and the idea that eating disorders are about food. They are to a small degree, because food is the mechanism or the vehicle, but actually it's about feelings. So now let's move on to binge eating disorder. Now, this is something that's going to come up a bit later on again, and I think this is something that's very prevalent in the Black community. We've seen 216% of Black Africans have been admitted to hospital, and I believe that things like binge eating and bulimia are the reasons for this. So about 22% of people that suffer from eating disorders suffer from binge eating disorder, or BED, BED. That's how I remember it. And the first thing I'll say about binge eating disorder, it's not just the same as overeating. Okay, so sometimes you feel a bit sad, maybe your partner broke up with you and you want to eat a bit more ice cream for comfort. That's within normal realms, okay? That's not a binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder shares a lot of signs with bulimia, but the only difference is you're not actually getting rid of anything. So you're not purging, you're not being sick, you're not taking, you're not doing any of that. You're maintaining the weight and actually adding weight to you. So what are some of the signs of binge eating disorder? So one of the first and obvious signs, eating significantly larger than normal amounts of food in a short period of time. Okay, so you see someone sometimes gorging, and that's the word I use, gorging on food. They often may feel out of control about their eating. So feel like they can't stop. Okay, and you'll find things like evidence of binge eating will be things like disappearance of large amounts of food. Maybe you're not even remembering that you've eaten it. You may find a large amount of empty food containers and food wrappers. So once again, well, I'm saying the dissociation, you're not even aware that you're eating these things, but the only evidence is that the wrappers are there. And a person may eat in secret, usually alone, because they find it quite shameful. But the difference between binge eating disorder and the other two eating disorders and most of the others is that there usually will be weight gain. So the person will usually be overweight or obese because they're consuming all of this food and they're not necessarily hungry. So binge eating episodes are usually associated with 3 or more of the following things, okay? So eating more quickly than usual, eating when you're not hungry, eating alone and hiding due to the shame, feeling disgusted, depressed, or guilty afterwards, feeling distressed by binges, which actually may trigger you to start another one. And there are no compensating behaviors like there are as in bulimia. So you're not getting rid of this food. So you would expect to see a lot of weight gain. But this has knock-on effects for your physical health. So physical health and mental health are always interrelated. But with something like binge eating, how it shows up are things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, gallbladder disease. I know a lot of people with gallbladder issues are wondering if that has anything to do with eating disorders. Fatigue, as you would expect, joint pain, sleep apnea, which is more than snoring, it can involve you stopping breathing. And once again, a risk of gastric rupture during binging. Now, bulimia, like I've said before, and binge eating disorder are more common, are the most common eating disorders within the Black community. So guys, are we eating our feelings? I know so many Black people with those illnesses, those physical illnesses. So once again, are we seeing eating disorders when they're in larger bodies? Because we think of eating disorders as something that happens within smaller bodies. We're going to have a look at that a bit later, the Black community, because we've got a particular problem there. Okay, there are other eating disorders, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID, which makes up about 5%, I believe, of all eating disorders. And that's just when a person avoids or restricts certain types of food, as well as restricting the overall amount of food that they consume. That could also involve weight loss. So possible reasons for ARFID. Okay, sensitive to taste, texture, smell, appearance of certain types of food. I mean, how common is that? I speak to people every day, and me, myself, there's things that I don't eat. I don't like the look of milk. I don't like the texture of porridge. Some people are only able to eat foods at a certain temperature. So this can lead to sensory-based avoidance or restriction of intake. So when you're thinking about potentially neurodiverse people, a lot of people on the autism spectrum have issues with textures of food and so forth. So different things like neurodiversity potentially ended up in an eating disorder if we're not careful. What causes ARFID, or avoidant restrictive intake food disorder? So you may have had a distressing experience. And a lot of people that I know, including myself, I've had a distressing experience with fish and crab sticks, and I no longer eat food, fish or crab sticks. I don't. Porridge, I'd rather be tortured than someone to feed me porridge. People with this disorder may not recognize that they're hungry and see eating as a chore. I know quite a few people that if you didn't remind them, they wouldn't eat. Okay, so avoiding or restricting can have a negative impact on a person's physical and psychological health. And it can also affect your life. You know, it's going to make it harder for you to socialize at school and around friends if you've got these particular food phobias and stuff like that. There are other eating disorders as well that are either not that common or cannot quite fit into a particular box, and we call those other specified feeding and eating disorders, or OSFED. Now, OSFED makes up about 47% of eating disorders. Nearly half of the eating disorders that we think of are not really ones that we even know about. So once again, that's the reason why we're talking about eating disorders. Now, I'll tell you a funny story. I suffer from a particular type of feeding disorder. I do think I have ARFID. I do think that's down to sensory issues, but I also suffer from something called PICA. Now, I don't know how many of you know about PICA, but you would have heard about it, maybe not know the term, but you would have heard stories. It's a feeding disorder where someone eats non-food substances with no nutritional value. So we're looking at things like paper, soap, paint, chalk, or ice. Okay, so for a diagnosis of PICA, we just have to make sure that this behavior is present for at least a month. It's not part of cultural practice, because it might be cultural practice for you to eat certain things. I can't imagine why. But you also need to make sure it's developmentally inappropriate, because as we know with children, they have a habit of eating anything they can get their hands on. So for that reason, PICA is not diagnosed before the age of 2, right? Now, it affects all genders. So there's possible reasons for it, but there's no definitive science on it at the moment. It's not that well researched, okay? So it's possibly linked to the nervous system, okay? I've heard that said. Now, it could be linked to mineral, vitamin deficiency, which I tend to agree with, because my craving is for ice, and that tends to represent low levels of iron, which I do have because I am anemic. So whenever my mum or my partner see me go into the freezer to crunch ice, you know, it's Lee, have you been taking your iron tablets? It can be learned behavior. You might see someone else doing it and can use it as a coping mechanism, but it's more likely to occur in pregnancy. Obviously, we know in pregnancy, some women get the weirdest cravings. And interestingly, my mum craved ice when she was pregnant with me. So we looked at things like iron deficiencies, autism. So once again, this comes up here, PICA. It can be a sensory thing. Like I've said, my thing is ice. My partner's thing is corn flour. So we're often sat in each other's company, me crunching ice, her eating corn flour. But I'm actually happy that she now eats corn flour, because in the past she's used more harmful things, like eating soap powder and stuff. But it is actually a craving that you cannot really get to the end of until you eat what you need to eat. But it may be associated with intellectual development disorders, depression, OCD and related disorders, which seems to make sense to me, and things like schizophrenia. So what are the possible signs of PICA? So I hope you guys go away and research this, because you may be one of those people that are eating these non-food substances and didn't really think twice, but some of them can be extremely harmful. So we do need to be aware. So the possible signs are craving to eat substances that are not supposed to be eaten. Okay. The next sign is that you're eating things that are not supposed to be eaten. And the third thing, physical illness as a result of eating harmful substances. So if you have issues with PICA, it's very important that you try to find a less dangerous alternative to what you crave, because you can understand that eating soap powder tablets is going to be quite harmful for you. So maybe try the corn flour. It would be irresponsible for me not to mention another thing on this podcast. Now, a lot of people may have heard of body dysmorphia, and that's just when a person or an individual is obsessed with a perceived flaw that they have, and it overtakes their everyday life. Now, sometimes people with body dysmorphia will have an eating disorder, because like I say, eating disorders tend to coexist with other mental health conditions. But body dysmorphia is not an eating disorder, okay? It's a lot more closely related to OCD, and it should be treated as such. So body dysmorphia is not an eating disorder. So I thought I'd just mention that, just in case anybody was expecting me to talk about it in terms of being an eating disorder. It's more of an obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's from that family of mental illnesses. So guys, how are we feeling now? Are you actually thinking, so are we starting to see that eating disorders are not necessarily what we think? Are we looking at all of those signs and thinking, wow, that's extensive? Are we starting to see that potentially, there's a problem? But what I think is always important is that we look at our own relationship with food. So when I was studying, I remember one of my tutors, we had a particular lesson on food. And I remember thinking, why are we talking about food? I'm training to be a therapist. I'm not a nutritionist. And one of the first things she said was, we all have a relationship with food. And I thought, okay, all right, love. We all have a relationship with food. But then she said, what's your relationship with food? And she started to tell us some of her background with food and the historical experiences. And how often do we think about that? Like I say, when I deal with my clients, I always explore what their relationship with food is, because like I say, things like eating and sleeping underlie a lot of mental health. But when you're looking at your relationship with food, you have to look at not only what it is now. So what is your relationship a healthy one? Were you maybe forced to eat things as a child? Were you food shamed a lot as a child? Were you food praised? Because I know that I was praised a lot. My grandmother's Jamaican. I had a dumpling in my hand from as soon as I could dribble. Okay. And I was praised a lot for eating a lot. It was praised in my culture and in my community and in my household for eating more. You're a good girl for eating loads. So that knock-on effect. Everyone has a relationship with food. And it follows you into adulthood. So if you saw dysfunctional eating patterns from your parents, it may be that you've picked it up. Do you see food as a chore? Maybe it's because you were once again forced to eat things that you didn't like. So you may have all these food phobias. We have to look at our own relationship with food. I know that when I'm stressed, I don't eat much. But when I'm sad, I might eat more. But knowing what your own relationship with food gives you an idea of what your mental health is like at that particular time. So if I'm eating loads and loads and loads, I may not stop and think, oh my gosh, I'm eating loads and loads and loads just for the sake of it. But actually, I might be eating loads and loads and loads because I'm sad. So it's knowing that. So what are the risk factors of eating disorders? Because with all mental illnesses, we want to know what causes it. And I spoke about it with depression being more than one thing. And it's the same with eating disorders. But we can have a look at what's in the eating disorder backpack. So straight away, we're going to throw in things like genes, biology, epigenetics. Once again, I love that word. We're going to throw all of that in. We're also going to throw in the fact that we do know that having a family member that has an eating disorder makes you more likely to have one. So we'll throw all of those things into the backpack, all right? So the biology, the genetics, the epigenetics, the family member. But then we have to look at some other things, because it's not just one thing, because not everybody that has a family member that has an eating disorder has an eating disorder. So once again, we have to take a closer look. So socioeconomic background, okay? So we're looking at things like poverty, dysfunction, potentially stress, racism, all the things that come, discrimination, which is linked to deviant eating behaviors as well. But the stress and hardship of being poor can cause a child to find unhealthy ways to cope, and an adult. So we can't discount these factors. And if you're Black, you're always going to have that added layer of discrimination. And if you're a Black woman, the intersections, okay? Your background could be one of the reasons why you're more susceptible to developing an eating disorder, okay? Going to therapy and maybe looking at aspects of your childhood and healing from it may help you if you have an eating disorder because of that. Next, and I'm sorry, the parents always get something, but your attitude of your parents. What was your historical formative experiences of food and the discipline around food? Were you punished for not eating your meals? Were you allowed to get away with eating meals? Children often inherit their parents' dysfunction, whether that be food phobias, irregular eating, overeating. What you see your parents do, you're gonna then go on and do. Research has shown that parents who put pressure on the kids to be thin were the leading cause of eating disorders in puberty. Now, this is what I want to talk about, food shaming. Now, I see a lot of young people in therapy, and a lot of them have been food shamed, and it does affect the way they view themselves in terms of their body image and in terms of the way they eat and their relationship with food, okay? But equally, like I said, I was praised for eating food, and that can have a knock-on effect of overeating, because I do see a lot of overeating, and especially in the Black community. Why are you eating so much? Were you praised for that? Was there not a lot of food at home? So now you see food and you're on a seafood diet. You must see food and eat it. So we have to look at, are we food praising and food shaming our children? Because children are very sensitive to food shaming. In this day and age where you have all these perfect images of people on social media, food shaming and weight shaming is not the way to go. Neither is food praising. Okay, so maybe just encourage your children to tell you the portion size that they want, so there's no food shaming involved. But negative comments about weight definitely going to play into it. I lost a very good friend when I was at college for constantly making comments about my weight. And my weight was up and down due to the fact that I have Graves' disease and I have no thyroid now. So my metabolism goes up and down. So I would dramatically lose weight and then dramatically put it back on, and constantly having those comments. People felt like it was okay to tell me I was skinny. I'm not telling you you're fat. Why are you so offended at being called skinny? Maybe I don't want to be skinny. Maybe skinny is not my ideal. So that's another thing that comes into it. Don't always assume that everybody wants to be skinny, okay? Because I don't want to be skinny. So you mentioning to me how much weight I've lost is as harmful to me as me telling someone who may be heavier how much weight they've gained. So we do need to look at that when we're making comments. So a history of addiction in the family, all right? So there's not an exact cause. It's not fully understood, but genetic, epigenetic disposition towards impulsive behavior, potentially, stress, which can be a factor in developing addiction and eating disorders. But abuse and trauma. Childhood abuse is linked to eating disorders. I will not stop saying it. It may serve as a coping mechanism for unresolved pain, but also a way of preventing abuse. I've heard stories of people that binge eat to gain weight so that their abuser would no longer find them attractive. But equally, I've heard stories of people that maybe starve themselves or have bulimia or binge eating because they're ashamed of their body and they want to destroy that very body that's brought them shame. There's no one story. No one story is the same. So then there's a family history of obesity. So if you have a family history of obesity, your risk of developing an eating disorder is higher. Potentially anorexia and bulimia to break the pattern of being obese. But then you have the predisposition then and the unhealthy eating behaviors that you've learned. So maybe binge eating as well. So low self-esteem. And that self-image is a result of your childhood experiences. So did you have a lot of weight struggles when you was a kid? Because that tends to follow you into adulthood. The next thing that's kind of a big risk factor is cultural standards. Eating disorders are mainly a Western culture issue. I'm not saying they don't have it in other cultures, but I would expect to see it a lot less. I feel like in this country, we're exposed to images of this ideal standard of beauty and a standard body type, usually thin. And absorbing these images on a day-to-day basis is very harmful, and it can have a profound effect because people are often trying to reach these unrealistic levels of perfection. Now, maybe less so adults, but I would say definitely teenagers that are impressionable, but definitely some adults. I see some adults acting a fool from what they see on social media. And we have to look at that. If that's how it makes you feel, why would you consume that? Why are we consuming things that make us feel negative about ourselves? I think with Black British people, there are different cultural standards and potentially different relationships with food. It's important that we talk about that. So I did some research and I looked on ORI, so that's ORRI, ORI, and it's a specialist eating disorder organization for people of color. And on that website, they highlighted a few things, and I put together some of my own thoughts. And I thought the Black community definitely has particular challenges. More Black people than white people are being admitted to hospital with eating disorders in terms of percentage-wise. 53% of other Black minorities and 216% increase in Black Africans. So there are particular challenges around eating disorders in the Black community. I think the first thing that we need to look at, as in all things with Black people and Black women in particular, is a lack of representation in mainstream media. I spoke to my partner about it and I said, do you know any Black celebrities of eating disorders? And she had to think about it for a long time, and she came up with Gabrielle Union. Fair enough, I hadn't heard about that. But when I looked at white celebrities, I saw people like Sam Smith, I saw Demi Lovato, I could go on and on. Basically the idea is I saw a range of celebrities in the mainstream media that had been open about their struggles with eating disorders. Maybe it would be helpful because there are Black celebrities that have obviously gone through eating disorders and maybe have gone through it now. So why not speak about it? It would be helpful to people within the community that are still struggling. We need to hear that these things are happening. We need to know that these things are happening. Okay, but there's also a lack of representation in research. So we've got the media, we've also got research, and those things tend to follow all the way through in terms of Black people's mental health. The research that is available, if it is on Black people, tends to be on Black American people. And the Black American and the Black British experience is very different. So it's not going to be the same factors that are contributing to these eating disorders. So we need some more representation in the media, but we also need people potentially like myself that are doing more research. So I've just made more work for myself. Like with Black people, a lack of access to treatment, not given the same opportunities, the racial bias in the healthcare system, it not being diagnosed, and that racism that exists in the healthcare system having the knock-on effect that there's this mistrust. So now Black people don't believe in this healthcare system, so that therefore they're not being diagnosed. So I've alluded to it throughout the podcast, but the general invisibility of eating disorders other than anorexia. Black people more likely to suffer with binge eating and bulimia, and this idea that eating disorders only happen in smaller bodies. I think that is a big one. Okay, that's a very big one. I think the stigma that Black people have around mental illness, we still have that in our community. I mean, thankfully, things are changing slowly, but they're not changing fast enough for me. I still see an element of that's how I was raised, or that's how I am, or that's not acceptable, or a lot of judgment to do with mental illness. And that is the same with eating disorders. So having to present as strong, so whether it be a strong Black man or a strong Black woman. So we're having to present as strong and, being vulnerable, but is that leaving us liable to actually, are we literally eating our feelings? Are we eating our feelings, Black people? Are we eating our feelings? Okay, so let's take a different look. So obviously I'm a Black woman, and I know any event I go to where there's Black people involved, there's going to be food. So whether it's a 9-night, a funeral, a wedding, a gathering, it's the opening of an envelope, there's going to be curry goat on the fire and some rice and peas somewhere there. Okay, and that's something that we've just become so used to. And I've seen people pile the food on their plates. Do you want more? Like I say, being praised for eating more. The emphasis in Black culture, soul food, is on food. It's almost like a love language for Black people. Anything that's going on in your life, I'll cook for you. So every occasion, we're praised for overeating. It's our love language. We're overeating. We're seeing the physical health effects. Black people, we do have more type 2 diabetes, higher cholesterol, heart disease, joint pain. We have all of these things that are the knock-on effect of eating too much, okay? It's in our culture. We were taught to eat, maybe as a way of comforting. So we're eating. We're trying to fill our emotional void and fill it with food. And that's what we've been doing, and we've been doing it for generations. And I feel like it's only now that we're starting to see that we've been eating too much forever. So like I said, my own relationship with food, I was praised so much for eating loads. But now I put a healthy amount on my plate, because we have this idea that we have to eat everything that's on our plate. Stop when you are full. Stop eating your feelings. So I spoke a bit earlier about the 50% rise in hospital admissions for ethnic minorities. And my opinion now is that it's mainly because we're not talking. We know that we're not talking. I've got this podcast because Black people are not talking. I would argue that some of them are not listening either, but they're definitely not talking. So that combination of not listening to information and not talking about your feelings is not a very good one, guys. Black people, we need to talk about our feelings. And we also need to get better at recognizing these things. Okay, so things like eating disorders and mental illnesses. We've already got racial bias in the system that needs to be challenged. We also now need to challenge our own internal biases and stereotypes, because it's preventing us from getting the help that we need. Okay, now I cannot not talk about this 216% rise for Africans, for Black Africans. I spoke with a few people about it and I said, why is it more than Caribbeans? But I said it in being Black and British, we're not a homogenous culture. Okay, we might all be Black and British, but we've got very distinct experiences. And I feel that within the African community, even though all communities in this world, we live in a patriarchal society, okay? But I feel like within the African culture, especially West African, it's a lot more patriarchal. I'd say all of it. It's more patriarchal. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So I wouldn't say that the patriarchy doesn't exist in Jamaican or Caribbean culture, but you see it with Jamaican men and Caribbean men. They can cook, a lot of them. Not all of them, but a lot of them, they cook, they clean, they can look after the children. When I speak to my African friends, especially the more traditional ones, because it is changing, it's very much geared towards the man. Everything in your life is about who your husband's going to be. So you have to look good for your husband. You have to do this for your husband. And then your life is all about your husband until you have kids. And then it's about your husband and your kids. And it's never really about you. I feel like, where's the space for potentially African women to speak? Who are they speaking to? It's all about revering your men. I've grown up with a lot of Nigerian and Ghanaian friends and females, and I spent a lot of the time in the kitchen with them instead of playing out while the boys are out running around. Now, I do think that's changing slowly, but I do feel like in things like Jamaican culture, it's a bit more matriarchal in some senses. Like I say, the men cook and clean, and Jamaican women don't stop telling you how they feel about things. But once again, it's a similar culture where it's all about food. You'd find it very hard to body shame a Jamaican, I might add. I don't think it's possible to body shame a Jamaican. They are happy with whatever shape they tend to be in, but it's something that needs speaking about within the Black community. I'd like some of my African friends to get back to me and suggest to me possible reasons why you guys are suffering more with eating disorders, or at least going to hospital more. What's going on? Is it that we're not catching it in time and it's only when it's a crisis? African people, what's going on? We need to look at some different things. We can't cover it all. We have to wrap it up at some point, but let's have a look at some of the stigmas and myths quickly. It's not just white teenage middle-class girls that get eating disorders. We know that now. Eating disorders happen in bigger bodies, not just small bodies. There's a lot of shame around eating disorders, which is why I'm talking about it today and why people don't talk about it. There's a lot of shame, and it often has to do with your feelings. It's not about food, it's about feelings. Shame may make you eat more, okay? It's not only women. We've said 25% of people with eating disorders are men, and like I said, it could be higher than that. So once again, it's about control and feelings, not about food and weight. Why can't you just start eating? Why can't you just stop eating? Because it's not about food, it's about feelings. And also remember that eating disorders are a mental illness. So actually telling someone, why can't you just start? It's just like saying to someone with depression, why don't you just feel better? Why are you upset? Why are you down? It's not very helpful. Okay, a lot of people feel like if you have an eating disorder, it's something that stays with you forever. That's not true. The earlier the intervention, the better. But with the right help, you can have a healthy relationship with food again. Eating disorders make people skinny. We know that it happens in larger bodies. This podcast has been a long one, and it's a lot to take in because people don't really think of eating disorders as a mental illness. They don't see maybe it in themselves. But what can you do if it's you? So first thing, to recognize you may have an eating disorder and that is not your fault. Okay, so hopefully this podcast, if you're listening, may have helped some people identify potentially either an eating disorder or potentially being at risk of one. Okay, but it's not your fault. Talk to someone you trust. Once again, always important. Talk to someone you trust. Get those feelings out. Improve your self-esteem. This in turn will improve your body image and you'll feel better about yourself. Low self-esteem is a big risk factor. Seek medical support. And if possible, bring a friend, because eating disorders are often misdiagnosed. So you may need that moral support to be a bit assertive and say, actually, no, I have a problem with an eating disorder. Seek outside and specialist support because it's out there. And I'll tell you a few of them a little bit later. But like I said, what can we do to help other people? We can, if we're worried about someone, we can approach them and talk about it. It's not going to be comfortable, but we know that with these difficult conversations can be had. And the person may find it such a relief that someone's willing to talk to them about something. But what I would suggest is that you don't do it during a food setting. As you're sitting down to eat, it's not the right time to talk to someone about an eating disorder, okay? It's not the right time. Okay, so you need to do the same things that you do with a lot of things. You need to listen and communicate non-judgmentally. So no, why don't you just eat? You're starving yourself is not going to be helpful. You should always have some support and information to hand with eating disorders because they're very specialized and often misdiagnosed by GPs. Encourage the person to seek professional help because once again, it's not always recognized by GPs, but there are outside organizations. So we've got BEAT, which is a brilliant organization that deals with eating disorders. That's open, I think, up until 9 p.m. on most weekdays and 5 p.m. on the weekend. But they have extensive information about all manner of eating disorders and what you can do, self-help and organizations on that website. So check that out, BEAT. We also have FREED, FREED, which is an early intervention program, I think, for 16 to 25-year-olds that have been experiencing an eating disorder for less than 3 years, because we know that early intervention is key. It is very, very key. What else? What other organizations do we have? We have ORI, which I spoke about. So that's ORRI, which specializes in eating disorders in the Black community. And we have the NHS website, which is very helpful on all manner of things. So just thinking, family and friends are always going to be important with any mental health struggle that you have. But particularly because eating disorders has such a high incidence of death, it's very important that as a family unit, as a friendship unit, if you know now that someone in your midst is suffering from an eating disorder, that you check in regularly and you check in asking them if they're suicidal. Because we said up to 60% of people with eating disorders have suicidal ideation and behavior. So that means that they're attempting it and they're dying more than any other mental illness. So we need to check in and we need to have these support groups to hand. Yeah, we need to access these helplines and these charities because this is killing people more than any other mental illness. So guys, I hope that you've taken something away. And the key things I think that I hope that you've taken away today is that eating disorders are about feelings, not food, and maybe looking at how neurodiversity, because that's something that I'm going to get to eventually, is something that's very important to me. It's affected my life and my loved ones' lives. It's something I will get into, but how neurodiversity plays into it. But the Black community, their particular challenges around food. So I'm hoping that we're looking a bit closer at how much we eat. But I hope that everybody's looking at their own relationship with food and what it tells them about their mental health. Look back into your past. What was your relationship with food? What were the parental attitudes? What were the cultural standards? Because sometimes the things that you assume as your own is actually been drummed into you. What does your relationship with food tell you about your mental health? It's very interesting when you actually start looking at things like that. So eating disorder is a mental illness. So guys, please, no judgment. You need to eat more, you need to eat less. So maybe if you're someone that's dieting, been dieting for years and you can't understand why you never really lose weight and you always relapse, maybe it's time to stop looking at the food and start looking at the feelings, because the feelings are what's underneath the behavior and the need to have disordered eating. So there's a lot of people eating their feelings. We need to start talking about our feelings and stop eating them. So guys, I hope this has been useful for you today. It's been a lot to go through and potentially I may have missed something that's important to somebody. But if that's the case, hit me in the comments. There's still not enough engagement. If anything, it seems to be going down. But yet I'm getting all of this feedback. People are coming back to me saying they enjoyed the podcast or they got something from the podcast. So if you got something from it, share it. And don't just share it with one person. Share it with 5 people. Let's start to see these numbers go up, because this is my motivation for doing this. I'm not paid. This is done in my free time, and it's done to help other people deal with their mental health. So you need to let me know that not only are you watching, but what you want to see. I now have selected episodes on Spotify, so you can find me over there. If it's your first time seeing me on YouTube, I am apodcast26 on IG and at Lead the Therapist on TikTok. So I have a very vibrant TikTok community, and I'm trying to get it over here a bit on YouTube and Spotify, a bit like how it is over on TikTok. I have a lot of followers on TikTok and I have a lot of interaction and engagement, and I get a lot of support from my followers on TikTok. Of the people that listen to this podcast are my friends. My friends, guys, you need to do a bit more. Start spreading this message a bit more. Don't just listen to it and be like, oh, wow, Lee's on the screen. spread these podcasts, because I do feel like the reach needs to expand. No one's going to come to any harm from listening to a mental health podcast. It might not be as juicy as how many people you've slept with this week. I know it's not quite as exciting as talking about your love life, but conversations about mental health are very important. There's so many people suffering with so much stuff that I don't understand why you wouldn't listen. We need to start getting better at seeing our challenges and not just distracting ourselves with other stuff, mundane stuff that we can get distracted with. Let's stay focused and start working on ourselves. There are people out there suffering from a variety of things, eating disorders being one of them. So guys, hit me up in the comment. If you like what you heard, saw, press like. If you don't, comment and tell me what you didn't like. And if you're listening, share, because that's how we spread this message. We need to start having difficult conversations. Guys, please join the discussion, okay? But for now, Lee's out, Tap's out, and I'll see you next time, which will be in a couple of weeks, where I will revisit domestic abuse, but I'm conducting an interview with a gentleman that works with male victims of domestic abuse. So check me out in a couple of weeks, I'll be back. And until then, guys, just loads of self-care. It's really grey and glum is the word I would use, but loads of self-care. Just attach yourself to the things that make you feel good and just draw a line under the things that don't. So take care of yourself, and I shall see you next time on Tap.